again to another episode of Active Perspective Podcast Season 2. I'm your host, Hugh Semenik. Today, our guests are Nathan Gates and Dr. Brian Pilecki, experts on the therapeutic value of psychedelics. Nathan Gates is a psychotherapist and regenerative counterfarmer in West Central Illinois. His career and training have been inspired by insights from psychedelic medicines for more than 20 years. He is also a founder of the Psychedelic Special Interest Group with the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science and has spoken at regional and international conferences on the usefulness of utilizing contextual behavioral perspectives to make sense of and integrate insights from psychedelic experiences. Dr. Brian Pilecki is a clinical psychologist at Portland Psychotherapy that specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders, trauma, and PTSD, and matters related to the use of psychedelics. He's an active researcher and has published on topics such as anxiety disorders, mindfulness, and psychedelics. His paper on ethical and legal issues in psychedelic harm reduction and integration therapy outlines the risk for clinicians conducting psychedelic integration for clients who are using psychedelics on their own. At Portland Psychotherapy, Brian is also a study therapist on a clinical trial investigating the use of MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of social anxiety disorder. He's also co-chairperson for the Special Interest Group on Psychedelics and on the ACBS website. He co-hosts a podcast called Altered States of Context about the intersection of psychedelics and psychotherapy, and has appeared on several national podcasts as well, such as Very Well Mind and Beyond Addiction. We open with Nathan Gates giving us a brief history of psychedelics in the West. Enjoy.
We're talking about various time scales, of course, because you can really look throughout human history and find evidence of the use of what we today call psychedelic substances. Cave paintings with mushrooms. South American temples that have residue from San Pedro cactus, and all kinds of iconography on the walls that suggest this is a temple in Chavin. That suggest ritual use. So way back, our relationship with plant medicines. Now in the West, it's a much shorter history because this sort of, at least to I think mainstream usage, kind of was lost to the West for quite some time, and it really was in the 20th century with sort of mescaline coming from the interface with Southwestern native people, the peyote, which contains mescaline, which is a really powerful psychedelic. And so there was, mescaline kind of entered into the culture, the American culture at that point. And then later, I think it was, forgetting, it was in the 40s or 50s. I can't remember exactly. A gentleman went down to Mexico and took mushrooms with a curandero named Maria Sabina, and brought that back and made a Time Life article, and got a lot of attention for psilocybin, a lot of curiosity. And so it began to sort of percolate, throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s in sort of intellectual circles, kind of like, it was a cultural curiosity, I would say. Artists and intellectuals were really interested in it. And that sort of changed then when Albert Hofmann discovered LSD, quite by accident, synthesized it in his Swiss laboratory, put it away for a while, got it out for some reason, intuition, because he thought it might work for something else, got some on his fingers and tripped, which was quite a surprise if you weren't expecting it. And then went back to it later and was like, what is this? And took some, and then really tripped balls in modern parlance. And had a famous bike ride back to his house. And it was a pretty bad trip, I think, because, as you might expect, if you're really tripping and you have no idea what's going on, and you took just a chemical, you might be kind of worried. But that, opened up, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals was the name of the pharmaceutical company. And they were interested in, well, what kind of applications does this have? And that really opens it up to the modern medical history of it, within the medical and psychiatry, seeing like Sandoz basically sent it out to anybody who wanted to experiment with it. Like, hey, here's this chemical that does some wild stuff, and we think it might be useful. But if you want to toy around with it and see what it does, go for it. And so, it was used in a lot of ways. It was believed, one model that was used for a while was that it was called a psychotomimetic, which they thought it mimicked, basically psychosis. So they thought this could be really useful. We can have something that can temporarily engender a psychotic state, and we can learn a lot about psychosis and maybe about the treatment of psychosis. And so that was a model that was used for a while. Didn't really appear to be that useful. It was used psycholytically for a while, which was kind of a real Freudian approach to it. It's like, well, if you put a kind of a lower dose of LSD, the participant is still pretty with it and can talk, maybe they can help access the unconscious. And so it was very therapeutic Freudian, and it's like conceptualization. And then sort of by accident, people using it, therapists, scientists discovered that a big, huge dose created a big, huge experience, but that experience was extremely interesting and, for some people, often transformative. And that's kind of called the psychedelic approach to therapy. Like, it's a psychedelic dose, like a large dose given to engender an experience that's fairly major. Um, and and then, of course, there have been many, many, many other ways it's been used. The CIA got involved because they thought it might be an interesting mind control substance, and did a whole bunch of nefarious things, back in the 60s. But then famously, of course, it sort of escaped the gatekeepers. It escaped the laboratory and emerged into culture. LSD in particular, psilocybin too, and mescaline, but LSD was the big one because it was made, you could be made a huge batch, millions of doses could be made and distributed.
Right.
It's very, very, very potent, so it doesn't take up much space. So it was really easy to distribute everywhere. And so it's like literally, I think, kind of exploded across the culture. And it
Mhm.
made it from this sort of like social unrest that, at least maybe it was unprecedented, but maybe at least seemed familiar, to this like super weird thing. Now we've got these people who aren't just like protesting, but they're like playing music and taking off their clothes and standing in the street and moving out into the country, and talking about communes and not needing government, like like it's just like, well, now it's just weird, like what is happening. And so I think
Yeah.
that felt like control slipping away, from and so it's sort of a panicked backlash, led in part to the Controlled Substances Act, which made it illegal, ended research. Which, by the way, I don't think I mentioned that, during that time, 50s and 60s, as the scientists were studying this, there was a lot of work being done, on various forms of, mental illness, addiction, things like this. It's research that, if you look at it, doesn't quite, line up to the standards of today, because none of the research back then did. But it's also, you can't look at the body of what was done and just dismiss it out of hand either.
Yeah.
So there's definitely like strong signal that, like, there's some interesting stuff going on that seems useful, but we needed to know more. And then the opportunity to learn more was taken away for decades.
Right.
Um, uh, and of course, but psychedelics didn't go away. They've been used since then at, um, raves and Grateful Dead shows, and in the woods and around fires and with friends and in all kinds of settings. People have been using them, um, nonstop, since then. So they just obviously went underground, um, and then sort of reemerged, in the last, just really, really in the last decade, but the last 2 decades, but the last decade in a very accelerated way,
Yeah.
at places like, Imperial College in London, Johns Hopkins University here, studying it for, anxiety and end of life,
Mhm.
depression, um, and other things, leading to where we're at today, which is sort of a full blown, often called the psychedelic renaissance, but, kind of an explosion in interest and, academic interest, clinical interest. And that's the shortest version I could do. It
Yeah,
wasn't that
yeah,
short, but that was
beautiful.
about as
Yeah,
short as I could make it.
the person that's really came up in the book, in Pauline's book, a lot. Harvard psilocybin project was Leary, Timothy Leary, and how
Mm,
a lot of people just demonized him back in the '60s for uh, corrupting all the hard work that they did. But he wasn't the only one, right? And there was Timothy Leary, but also there was Richard Alpert, who now later became Ram Dass.
hmm
Um, can you talk, or Brian, can you also talk about how those players, those key players like Richard Alpert, Timothy Leary, what they contributed to the research going on and the culture that we have now?
Yeah, sure. There was also Ralph Metzner, who was at Harvard. I was lucky enough to study a bit with Ralph at CIIS in the early 2000s. He's since passed away, so he was kind of a personal mentor of mine. Um, I'm not familiar with their individual, I can't really say with specificity what their individual contributions were, but in general, they were interested in figuring out what this stuff was, this LSD that landed in their hands.
Mhm.
And Timothy and Ralph was involved, and others were involved in several key studies, the Good Friday experiment, the Concord prison experiment. So there was an initial attempt to try to figure out what are these altered states of consciousness, and how can they potentially be used to treat mental health problems. So right away, it was sort of thought that there's something healing, there's something associated with change and transformation that can come from these experiences. How might they be applied to treating mental health conditions? And some of the earlier research really focused mostly on substance abuse and LSD. But LSD was also applied to a range of other mental health problems, even schizophrenia itself, which today sounds a little crazy to think about using something that we have a better sense now that likely has a risk of increasing psychosis if you're vulnerable. But they were you know kind of exploring what is the potential for this.
Yeah, yeah. Was there a risk? The research wasn't so tightly controlled. Is that the same feeling today that, hey, we've got to watch our P's and Q's, because we don't, and this kind of like the research loosens, that we're going to lose funding and we're going to lose respect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the research back then was not very tightly controlled. I mean, first of all, we just didn't have the methodologies in science that we have today. Um, but I mean, there's even accusations of kind of fudging the data, misleading. Timothy Leary was accused of kind of distorting the data in one of his studies. So I do think that people who have gone into this area in the last couple of decades, really the last decade, have uh, had an eye towards the need to be extra rigorous, extra cautious because of the controversial nature of this work. And I think some of the earliest studies in this more recent movement of research are very well constructed, very rigorous trials that have allowed for this data that it's hard to criticize, right? I mean, if the data, if the research was not well conducted, critics could easily dismiss it and say, well, wasn't a great study. But so many of these studies were really well done, and the data, is strong. We could talk about that if that's interesting, but the data suggests promise here as a new clinical treatment.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. It serves as a good segue into, now let's move on to the psychedelic experience itself. we're talking about two different things, are we not? Of microdosing, and also the full experience, where people, fully trip. Can you talk about both, starting with this the what people typically experience with a full dose of psychedelics, and are there different types of psychedelics with different experiences? Other.
Um, yes, there are. Although, um, so you have roughly, I think you can say that there's like the classical psychedelics, psilocybin and LSD. Um, I think even though chemically mescaline is a little different experientially, it's generally put into that, the classical psychedelics, um, and they differ a little bit in quality, like the subjective quality of them, but more or less they are similar experiences. They differ by time. Like LSD is a 8 to 12 hour trip. Psilocybin's 4 to 8. Um, Mescaline, I think, is a little somewhere between. Um, and ayahuasca would be kind of in the classical psychedelic in that it behaves kind of similarly. And then there's MDMA. I think is the most prominent drug that would be entactogen or empathogen, or it's put in the same rubric as psychedelic, although it's not a true psychedelic. It is often thrown in that group, but it's a little distinct. A classic
MDMA,
psychedelic.
yeah, that's actually
Yes.
ecstasy, right? But okay,
Yes,
classically.
ecstasy. It's better known as ecstasy. MDMA, same chemical. Um, so a classical psychedelic, let's say psilocybin or LSD, they you, they last different lengths of time. So let's just go for the sake of being consistent. One thing, psilocybin, someone takes it, and it won't do anything for it's 30 minutes at least before generally there's much. Before the person would feel much, and then generally 45 minutes to an hour later the effects will come on pretty strongly. It will feel disorienting, and it's very hard to describe. Your perception will begin to alter. Colors will begin to become brighter or less bright. Closing your eyes, you might have not true hallucinations, like you wouldn't have an experience that something not there is there, but you would see all visions, potentially. um, you begin to lose, I think one of the more interesting aspects, it's one of the reasons it's hard to describe, is your sense of language really fades, and on a heavy trip it almost goes away. Words almost completely lose their meaning at all, which for an ACT audience I think is particularly interesting, that you're disabling the language function, um, and that very, very, very much changes the way you experience the world around you.
Yeah, yeah. I had my last podcast was Dr. Chris Niebauer. I don't know if you ever got a chance to read his book, No Self, No Problem. But he talks about a neuropsychologist, but he talks to the left and right brain, and how the left brain actually creates the language and the structure of our everyday consciousness, where the right brain is, and it's mostly more of a metaphor, but how he talks so much about left and right brain experiences. But this seems to me a shift then, if you're talking about an ineffable experience that can't be wrapped up in language, and I've heard that oftentimes a lot, that you're shifting from this kind of language structured left brain to now the right brain, where now it's you experience non-duality, dissolution of self. Can you get a little bit more about that rabbit hole of what one typically experiences in that direction?
Yeah, I would
I'd
say,
like to hear. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say I'd like to hear what you say. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead, Nate.
All I want to do was use a metaphor, and then I kind of want to, like, because it's the metaphor I think that I prefer to use for this, which is that if you think of your normal everyday experience as operating, you're operating from a map, like you're kind of like navigating the world. Your mental, your conceptual mental network, right, maps onto reality, and you kind of operate from that map. You're operating from your concepts, your thoughts. You're in that system, and generally that maps pretty well closely onto the world around you. um but not always, right? Like there's distortions in your map. There's areas in which your map is incomplete. There's areas in which your map kind of cause behavior that's not helpful, so your map and the territory aren't precisely the same, but you operate from your map. And when you take psychedelics, that map kind of poof goes away, and you're just standing in the territory. You're looking around and you're seeing everything unmediated by the concepts that you have learned about it. So when you see the couch, you're not seeing your concepts of couch, you're seeing directly this lumpy thing right there, and you're having like a direct experience of that that's not mediated by your conceptual learning history. That's how I like to think of it. And then I just wanted to throw that out. I think that's helpful. But yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I find another metaphor useful here besides that one, which is thinking about a fish swimming in water doesn't really understand the nature of water while they're in it. It takes it for granted. And one day the fish goes to the surface and flops out and experiences a whole different state of being in the air. And then is able to be like, holy crap, like what was that? That was so different than what I'm normally used to. And then that allows the fish, let's pretend, to be able to have a different perspective on what that water is. And in this metaphor, language is the language, symbols, categories is the water that we're all swimming in all the time. We don't realize how it limits our sensory, our embodied experience of being in the world. And so when you turn off that language valve and you have this sort of more direct or even kind of playful sensory experience of reality, it allows you then to understand what day-to-day consciousness is really about.
Right. Yeah, there's I think it was Bill Richards who said the experience is kind of like taking caveman and then transporting him in time to the center of Manhattan, present day Manhattan, and then transporting him back instantly and having him try to understand what just happened. And it's and then he also uses the code like we have 5 crayons, but we have 50,000 shades of that we have directly experienced. Do you think the most important there's two really big things that captured my attention in the psychedelic experience that I haven't had personally, but I've read a lot about, is one, the dissolution of the ego, and do you feel, and also this kind of ground base of knowing, just you can't explain it, but just a level of certainty that you've never had before. Your experience under psychedelics is more real than this everyday conscious experience, where one who hasn't had that experience would say, "Oh, that's just a drug hallucination." Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? One way I think about it is, when you're intoxicated on alcohol, I know when I've been drunk, I've had things that sounded like really good ideas. And then the next morning I wake up and I'm like, what an idiot. It doesn't hold up the next day. Very rarely with alcohol.
Same with weed. Yeah, I've experienced the same with weed, where it's like, oh, I feel so enlightened on weed. And then I've realized no, I'm not. I'm really not. But
yeah, so the strange thing about psychedelics is people who have these experiences don't tend to do that. Or if they do that, it's more of an attempt to sort of minimize it because it's hard to integrate. There is this kind of strange phenomena where people will, when they have these more, we could call them mystical type experiences, it feels as if that is somehow more real than this reality, or there's something there's some truth there. You know, people will say things like the universe was talking to me, or I was getting a download of information about the nature of reality. And of course, all this sounds really crazy to somebody who doesn't, have experience in this territory. And it is a strange phenomenon, but that is a consistent kind of feature of these more profound psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and there are people in history, like James Fadiman, and there's Steve Jobs actually. Is it true that they can actually prove that through their psychedelic experience, their profound insights, that's actually trained to groundbreaking technologies that we have today? Is that true, or is it that we're going to have those insights with or without psychedelics?
I mean, I don't know that that's provable, but certainly, I mean, I'm inclined to. You hear that enough, right? You hear that, like, I think that is a common enough refrain um, of people, claiming that they have insights that have been transformational in some way. Be it like the development of the like conceptualization of the double helix to to Steve Jobs, but even just more commonplace, you just talk to psychedelic users who will have had this particular insight and it allowed them to make changes in their life for that. So I just think it's a common enough refrain that you'll hear from people who use psychedelics. Why I think it would be, to just disbelieve that many people because of a sort of an abstraction that says, well, that can't possibly be the case from just a drug. Um, I think that kind of abstraction, takes like anecdote, they're anecdotes, but they're consistent and there's a lot of them over time. And I think this would be another area that would be, interesting to, study more. And there's been some work done with creativity. That's a common people claim to have creative insights. And I think another, and more evidence I would put on that is, you look at music and art, the impact of psychedelics on music and art is pretty tremendous.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I
and
just I
so,
just watched
talk,
yeah, I'm sorry. I just recalled mine. I just watched a documentary on Netflix with about Bob Weir, and he was one of the co-founders of the Grateful Dead, and how
oh yes,
all their music. He described telepathy and all these kind of paranormal experiences that they had that really influenced their music.
yeah, they were there they were there in the mid '60s in San Francisco,
Yeah.
co-creating that. Oh, I talked about the Grateful Dead for a long time, but I don't know that anybody wants to go there right now.
But what has been proven, though, is that this efficacy or this effectiveness with one or two therapeutic treatments of psychedelics having profound and lasting changes in personality and treatment of disorders, especially anxiety disorders, depression, things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we, in the last 10 years or so, there's been more trials after this hiatus where this wasn't really studied. And one thing to keep in mind is that these are very small, tightly controlled trials, with sample sizes of maybe 20 or so participants. The most data that we've got so far is the use of MDMA for PTSD. There's been several hundred participants who've received that treatment, and they're in current phase 3 trials. And the data is very good that it's MDMA assisted therapy. It is helpful in reducing symptoms of PTSD. And the other area is psilocybin for depression or end of life distress. So those are the two big areas right now. MDMA will likely be federally approved in 2023. Psilocybin will likely be federally approved in 2025-ish. But we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of what these different medicines might be good for what conditions, for what types of clients. And so I think, the early data, there was a meta-analysis that my colleague Jason Luoma published, which showed effect sizes for psychedelic assisted therapy to be around 2 to 3 times as large as traditional therapy or traditional medications. And again, these are tightly controlled early studies, so it's hard to interpret too much, but there's really not been any innovation in mental health treatment that has created such an improvement over existing therapies, right? Like, I'm an ACT person. I think, in the beginning, we all hoped that the data would show ACT is better than CBT and shows this big statistically significant increase. But it turns out, like, in terms of therapies, there's not one therapy that really outperforms another. But here's something that potentially could really outperform current treatments. And I think that's exciting and obviously warrants a lot more research.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Let's move on to the process, the therapeutic process. And Brian, I had you've conducted microdosing in your clinic, and Nathan, you haven't, correct? You're a psychotherapist, but have you dealt with psychedelics?
No, I have not, and I don't think anyone, like very few people have. Like with the microdosing, we can mention that real quick. The microdosing is taking a very small, by definition, I think it's a subperceptual dose. So, like let's say your standard, if we're talking street drugs, your standard tab of LSD would be about 100 micrograms, give or take, right? Subperceptual, to stay below a threshold that you'll perceive is, somewhere in the range of 15 micrograms. So, a little fraction of that. And the idea is that you take that, but you don't notice anything perceptually, but that it operates sort of on your brain in such a way to kind of, I don't know. It does something. We have 2 randomized controlled trials now that are like 2 randomized controlled trials of microdosing that don't show any effect at all. And the ones that do are not controlled. And this is the sort of, it's the exact kind of thing where the placebo effect would be tremendous. So when it's been studied, I'll just own that I'm a pretty big microdosing skeptic myself. I just don't, I believe that what psychedelics do fundamentally is they evoke an experience, and that experience helps us learn and make, like we learn from that experience. So it shifts our perspective, and that enables new learning. And to me, the subperceptual aspect kind of doesn't make any sense. I'm like, well, if you don't perceive anything differently, then how does it help? Like, it just doesn't make any sense conceptually to me. So it's one of those where the research sort of like plays to my personal biases, but I mean, still, I guess it's possible, but it definitely, I'm like, I see those 2 studies. I'm like, yeah, see, that's what I thought. So.
Yeah. So with microdosing, first of all, I haven't actually given psychedelics to any clients yet. What I do is provide therapy support for their own personal use. So they're using psychedelics on their own. I'm involved in a clinical trial of MDMA for social anxiety, which hasn't started yet as the time of this podcast recording. So typically, clients are using microdosing on their own, and there's not really much to do because there's no altered state of consciousness. They're taking the microdose, going about their workday, going about their lives, and maybe, reflecting on what they're experiencing, journaling about it, etc. I know there's a lot of integration therapists or coaches out there that work with microdosing. But for me, I'm also, that's not a stronger area of interest. I'm more interested in uh, more macrodosing, bigger experiences where there's some, as Nate said, some sort of experiential learning, right? If as ACT therapists, that's what we're very interested in. Some new way of experiencing themselves or their minds, their reality, and then using that to inform change.
Hashtag Team Macro.
Okay, all right. That's good to know. Because I remember like watching a YouTube video on James Fadiman, one of his lectures. Anyway, when he was saying, like, some people have been microdosing for 45 plus years, and he has this book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and I haven't read it yet, but I know he talks a little bit about the structure of microdosing and how it makes people feel. It doesn't give them the psychedelic experience exactly, but it kind of breaks down the walls to allows them to be more guided, I guess, and intuitive. It gives them an improved affect. Is that accurate?
I think people
That's the claim.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
People report all kinds of benefits.
Okay.
Microdosing.
Okay. And then just a more profound experience that you're talking about with how many, say, where you're talking about psilocybin, how many micrograms would be typical for a profound experience?
Yeah, so in the trials, they use synthetic psilocybin, so it's hard to make accurate comparisons. But the dosage used in the trials is about equivalent to 5 grams of dried mushrooms, which is a pretty sizable dose for most people.
Yeah.
Most people generally think somewhere around 1 or 2 grams is on the lower side. 2 to 4, medium size, 4 to 5 is a larger dose. Of course, people who are experienced psychonauts, you can take much more than that. It's safe. It's not like you're going to overdose on it.
Yeah.
But I always recommend starting with lower doses, especially if you're new. You can always add more later. But in the trials, in the context of that safe and supportive setting, they go for a pretty sizable dose to have a more intense transformative experience.
Yeah. I have a 16-year-old daughter. She has friends that, so of course, weed is prevalent, and I know she's talked about, our friends has shrooms, and we was like, oh, we want to all try shrooms, and we plan to go to a friend's house and have one of the larger sisters or older sisters watch them, and while they take shrooms, and I'm thinking, oh no, there's a huge red flag for me here. Is there a danger in just an unstructured use, or is it a fairly safe drug?
Yeah, so yes. The short answer is, I mean, yes, it's there is a risk. Um I think that it's important to know that right now, like all across the world, right? Like there are young people who are taking mushrooms, who are taking LSD, who are taking lots and lots and lots of drugs. It's happening right now in the context of prohibition, and it's done in environments that are not optimal, with low information, not knowing, not knowing much about the drug, not knowing the quality of the drug, not even knowing if the drug is what they think it is. Doing so without, and with those drugs in particular, it's also important to remember that almost all the time it's fine, but not always. There are risks, right? And so I'm not, endorsing that, but I'm also not condemning it. I'm not here to do either of those things. But I do think that what we need to think about when we think about young people and drug use is we need to think about maximizing the quality of information that young people have. We need to maximize the conversations that we have with our children about them, and we need to have good information. And our kids need to have good information, and they need to sort of have a reasonable and safe expectation, and right now, if anybody listening, I mean, if your kid wants to go do drugs and they're 16 or 17, if they want to go do psychedelic drugs, like they're going to be able to, right? Like they're going to have access. They're going to be able to find them. And that's the case right now, whether we like it or not as parents, so we need to arm them with information and with our relationship and with our guidance, allow them to come to come to a relationship with that or not, um so yeah, that's a tricky question to answer, but I do because I mean there's such a taboo around young people and drug use. I mean, I do think in an appropriate context, right, like there's a powerful element that could be a sort of a rite of passage, um that can be moving from childhood to adulthood in a safe environment, that it can be an experience that can be beneficial. I'd be a complete hypocrite if I would say that it couldn't be, because I was at late adolescence for me, but at the age when I had really transformative, profoundly positive experiences, right? And they were in naturalistic, unsupervised environments. So but I think that there's an element of luck there that I think most parents aren't really very comfortable with, that we can minimize the luck necessary by empowering people with good information, and ending prohibition, which really encourages a lot of very powerful incentives to have bad drugs out there and have bad counterproductive information out there, and to encourage a lot of like sneakiness and illicitness. And so I think that if we liberalize drug policy, I mean, I think it's going to actually give parents better tools with which to engage their kids around these issues.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They stress in the book a lot: set and setting, set and setting. So I am very interested in taking a full trip myself, but I want I want to do it the right way, where there's it's guided and the correct set and setting that I can gain full benefits. Can you talk a bit about more about the proper set and setting?
Yeah, this is definitely something that comes up when people are trying to plan, like, how do I use these? Um, I think it's good to be mindful of a lot of the details. So I think the important thing for me when I work with clients around this, and they ask that question to you, is it a place that you feel safe and comfortable? Um, if it's an early experience, you don't have a lot of experience or no experience, there should be somebody there with you, somebody that you trust, just to kind of look after you, look after your needs, answer the door if someone comes unexpectedly. We could talk about all kinds of different parameters, like, should I do this at home or not at home? Or should I do this outdoors? Or should I do it at night or during the day? I think ultimately the most important thing again is that you think it through, figure out what works for you, and make sure that you feel safe and comfortable. Ideally, the night before, you want to um, reduce your responsibilities so you can begin to allow your mind to settle. You don't go into it stressed out, closing off your Outlook email and then running to take the psilocybin because you're stressed. You want to kind of go into it almost like with a bit of a meditative attitude, like kind of slowing down, maybe less time on the phone, etc. And then you really want to carve out that day, if you can, and to not have responsibilities. And then even the day after, it's really hard as a parent. It's really hard having a job to really be able to do that. So, you have to fit it into your practical life, but the more that you can create a bit of a container to help prepare you to go into it settled, and then afterwards to allow some time to work with whatever came up, because you might have insights, you might have experiences that you'll want to kind of really sit with. And, as contextual behavioral therapists, we know the power of the environment. So the environment is going to pull us right back into our older ways of thinking and behaving. So, I think it's good to think about if you can have a psychedelic experience outside of your home. I mean, the idea of a trip or journey is to go away somewhere, and having a new environment helps, I think, facilitate that process of going someplace new. If we're at home, we're more likely to be reminded of our day to day lives, which, again, practically speaking, may be the best situation for a person. But, I'd recommend, if possible, to try to be in a newer environment.
Yeah. You both have a podcast. So, do a podcast called Altered States of Consciousness, correct?
Altered states of context.
Thank you. Altered States of Context. Have you all talked about your own personal experiences using psychedelics, and how has that transformed you personally?
We have, and I think in our first episode for our first season, we talked a little bit about kind of like how we came to be on this, on this path. But yeah, it's an ongoing, in my case, I'll obviously just speak for myself. In my case, it's a sort of an ongoing relationship over time. And so it isn't, there's a popular idea. Alan Watts said, when you get the message, turn off the phone or hang up the phone. The sort of idea that like, hey, psychedelics have this sort of like insight to offer. And once you get that insight, you're done. Or your best to be done, and then pick up a practice such as meditation or something like that. And that's an attitude that people take. Other people, think of it more as a relationship that evolves over time. That there are at many different stages of life, there are places that we get sort of stuck or hung up, or could use a different perspective or a nudge, and that use has utility throughout the lifespan. But that's a view that I would more endorse personally. I don't, I don't see why you would just take it once or twice and then be done. I mean, unless that's what you like and that's what works for you, I don't think that there's inherently a reason to it's, if done properly, I mean, it's a remarkably safe experience. Like it's not like, oh, you're taking this really huge risk, so you should probably only do it once. It's like, no, if you take care of the variables and you're intentional, it's a remarkably safe experience. And if you find value in it, by all means. And so, yeah, they've been, common that you will hear amongst many people is like, wow, I had this experience. It was among the most meaningful experiences of my entire life. Like that's emerged from research. People have said that, after their experiences. And if you talk to psychedelic users much at all, you'll hear some version of that story. And of course, I, have my own, and which is kind of what set me in this direction. Classical, what I guess you could call a classical mystical experience of union, of feeling that feeling you described of understanding in a very deep way, not an abstract way, but in a very deep experiential right now way of understanding the isness of the world. And that sticks with you. So for me, that's they've been really impactful. That's why I do what I do.
Ryan?
Yeah, similarly, I've had and talked about on our podcast and other places how psychedelics, transformed me or were so influential in my life. For me personally, now I sort of pursued psychedelics as one track, and then the second track was pursuing Buddhism and meditation. So I have a meditation practice, a Buddhist practice in a particular tradition of Buddhism that is kind of a good complement for me in terms of psychedelics. So, as I've gotten older, I probably, I spent more and more time with that more daily, regular practice than, psychedelic experiences. But I think it is a value in the psychedelic culture, the psychedelic community. You'll hear this phrase like you need to do your own work. That, I think for me, whether it's a psychedelic experience or a 10-day silent meditation retreat, it's like, am I willing to go there? Am I willing to look inside? Am I willing to have an altered states of experience that involves, that's hard, that's difficult, that's challenging, but that is valuable and leads to growth. So, if I'm going to ask my clients to do that, if I'm going to ask my clients to turn towards their pain and to not run from it and to sit with it, am I embodying that value in my day-to-day life? And being willing to do that then helps me be a better therapist, because I don't feel like a fraud or a hypocrite, or I don't feel bad when I'm asking clients to kind of look at their own pain, because it's something that I practice myself and that I know is valuable, and that I've experienced the value of that. So I think that's one of the great lessons that psychedelics have taught me, that is similar to what I get from my meditation practice, which is, acceptance, and not running from ourselves. And it's a lesson I still need to learn over and over again. I'm not done with that lesson. And so I need practices in my life to remind me to be open to my pain, to be open to all of my experiences, and to invest my time and energy into what matters, not trying to feel better.
Yeah, you're both go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Nathan?
Well, I kind of did. I kind of wanted to demystify too a little bit, because I think a lot of times when we talk about psychedelics, especially like, in kind of a clinically oriented, podcast, and, we talk about mystical experience. You can talk, it can sound very like serious business. And yeah, sure, it's that, but it isn't just that. And so, I mean, I think it's sometimes important to demystify. And your question initially was about personal experiences. So one popped into my head that I'll take a minute to share. And this is, I want to rewind back, way back to I was 21 years old. So many, many, many years ago. And I was studying abroad in Denmark for a semester. And in Denmark, in Copenhagen, there's a section of the city that was at the time known as Christiania, which was a abandoned military complex that a bunch of hippies moved into in the 60s and claimed as the Free State of Christiania. And they said, hey, Denmark, your rules don't apply to us. And the Danish government was like, well, you can't really do that. But, apparently, I don't know, we're Danes. And so I guess we'll let you, just no hard drugs. Just do what you want, but no hard drugs. And so while drugs in Denmark were not illegal, they freely and openly sold pot and mushrooms in Christiania. And so as a 21-year-old college kid, I thought this was really, really great. And went down there kind of often, but one night in particular, I went down there and got a few grams of mushrooms. I was by myself and ate them. And then I went to a bar that was there, and I was sitting there and I hadn't started to trip at all. And I was just sitting there, and then kind of start to feel something. And I'm having a conversation with a Moroccan gentleman, just kind of starting to feel chill. And I hear this, hey, hippie. I was at the time long haired and had a tie dye. Hey, hippie. And I turn around and there's this gigantic Danish man who looked like a Viking. And I was like, oh boy. And he comes up to me. He's like, are you American? I said, yes. He's like, I bet you don't speak Danish. And I said, no, I don't. I don't speak Danish. And he was like, well, I don't know why you'd come to our country and not speak Danish. I was like, yeah, sorry, I don't. And he's like, I'll teach you Danish. And then I'm really, like, at this point starting to trip very hard. And I have this guy, he's like a foot taller than me. He's huge. And he grabs me by my shoulders, and he's like 3 inches from my face. He's like, here, I teach you Danish. And he just starts speaking Danish into my face and then says, see, you understand? I was like, no. And then he does it again, and like I was crawling out of my skin, and I had to get out of there. And I did escape, and I went and I found a hillside, and sat down and had a very, very nice, pleasant evening. Like that energy from that sort of conflict or whatever really like sent me into a really energetic state. Then I went, sat on the hill, and kind of released all of that, and looked over the city, and it was wonderful. But it was a very fun night. It was a very interesting night. But this is the sort of like I told that story because it popped in my head about set and setting, and about context, and about, well, what's an ideal context? And it's like, well, yeah, you kind of want to make it ideal if you can, but it isn't always going to be ideal, and it isn't always this one very serious thing, and it's also weird, and it's also so I think sometimes it's important to poke, like take out a needle and poke that balloon of seriousness, and of like, this is just this like clinical thing, and we're going to use it to better ourselves. So that's the purpose of that, just to kind of demystify a little bit.
Thank you. You know what? For a second there, I was kind of hoping that when you were, I could see that guy shouting Danish 3 inches from your face, that all of a sudden you got like you were speaking Danish.
Yeah, and then I just understood. I got it. All of a sudden, I learned Danish. Now I'm fluent.
This is where Nate and I disagree. I don't believe Nate already knows this, but I don't believe in fun. I believe psychedelics are only serious business. So we tend to have a disagreement about this. That comes up from time to time.
Yeah, you're both actually like well trained in acceptance commitment therapy, process-based therapy that was really recently developed from CBT and other traditions. But do you feel, a larger question, do you feel like we're on now the cusp with the resurgence of psychedelics, the groundbreaking work that's happening with process-based therapy, and getting away from DSM syndromes, that we're on the cusp of something really big and wellness across this country and the globe? Is that
I hope. I mean, I hope so. I always, my initial reaction to hearing that question is, maybe it's because I'm anti-fun, is to temper expectations, right? Like, I think one of the dangers is we over idealize psychedelics as the cure-all. They're going to solve all our problems. You know, I think they're very powerful tools, which can be used, in a helpful way and an unhelpful way. But yes, I am excited about the potential of psychedelics, and combined with the psychological flexibility model, to point to these underlying processes of change that, as act therapists, we've known about for a while. And I think we can get even a better understanding as maybe that is what gets valued more in psychotherapy research rather than outcomes, right? We're looking at processes. So yes, I'm hoping, and I think, Nate and I talk about this. We wrote a paper together on this, that the psychological flexibility model in ACT is such a great fit for conceptualizing psychedelics, for talking about them, for informing therapy around them. We just think there's so many reasons why they work well together. And one of the things about psychedelic assisted therapy is there has not been a consistent theoretical orientation informing it. In fact, a lot of the studies take a more non-directed, kind of hands-off approach, very, very much to the therapy part. So as we get more down the line of looking at how to use these substances effectively, that's going to mean what types of therapy are best used to maximize the benefits from psychedelics.
Yeah. Nathan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, always. I was thinking how to answer that. I think that psychedelics have a potential to be very impactful to mental health care generally. Very impactful. Um, I think that psychedelic medicines, I think that psychedelics generally can be sort of revolutionary, not necessarily through therapy, but just in general to culture. I mean, I think there's that potential there. Um, who knows what will happen, right? I think that that's part of what's it's it's unpredictable. You're introducing into a very complex system, society, individuals, all complex systems. You know, these things, these agents that seem to um, disrupt established networks, right? They disrupt, and so how that will impact isn't entirely predictable. It's not entirely predictable, and so potential, which I think is great because at the moment, not to be kind of a doomer here, but we're like in a lot of deep shit. Pardon the language, but like, our climate's in a bad case. Our society's fraying at the edges. I mean, people feel it around the world. We've got issues. We got big problems, and I think that the systems that we live in right now could use a good kick in the teeth. And so I'm hopeful. But it's not predictable. It's a little chaotic. It's a little bit of a trickster. It's a little bit of a Loki energy in here. So um, when you ask it change the world, I mean, yes, but not necessarily in the way we think and not how we think. And it's sort of like a relinquishment of control to see like, where's this going to go? I think a lot of people want to tell us, well, this is how it's going to act, or this is what it's going to do. And I just think it's a little less predictable than that when you really have it in a complex system.
Yeah, yeah. When you were talking, I was thinking about something that Ram Dass said in one of his lectures, that suffering is a sandpaper for awakening. I'm not getting that quote exactly right, but what we're going through now is the doom and gloom, the anxiety is necessary for the shift in consciousness that we need. Is that you find that accurate, or
Yeah, I would. Sometimes I think about my clients. I work with OCD clients, let's say,
yeah.
who people with OCD are not usually excited to do exposure therapy and stop their compulsions. And so if they're not suffering enough with OCD, they're not going to be motivated to really do the hard work of the therapy.
Yeah, yeah.
They might say they are, but sometimes it's the case that they don't really follow through with the homework and what's required. But if they're really struggling, that's the prompt.
Yeah.
I think as someone, I talk about my own experiences with mental health problems in my own life. So that's what got me into therapy to begin with.
Yeah.
I look back on my own childhood depression and childhood anxiety, and as tough as it was, it forced me, it prompted me to learn how to take care of myself, mentally and psychologically. And so I'm sort of grateful. Like if I didn't have that suffering in my life, would I have been so invested in all of these practices of personal growth? So, I think we, as ACT therapists, we try to have different perspectives on suffering. And I like that quote by Ram Dass.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. The large part of my life, and it gives me thinking, a large part of my life was in complete suffering and many, many different types of therapist encounters that weren't very helpful at all. And so I don't have a good, now I want to say history, but I don't have a good perspective that psychotherapy is helpful based on the history. But the more that I've learned when I fell into this later in life, it was just I've been falling upward because I want to understand myself better. It's like, holy crap, like all these profound insights, there's just so much information. And it was just not until recently when I picked up Pauline's book and I contacted you guys and thought I need to know more about what the hell's going on with psychedelics. And I thank you so much for all the insights and information that you've given. It's fantastic. You both now are on the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, and head up the psychedelic special interest group.
Yep.
And what else is going on that you're spearheading right now that you want other people to know?
So the SIG that Nate started, Nate and I are current co-chairs. He's really trying to organize community around ACBS and ACT and psychedelics. We're growing. We've got people from all over the world now, which is really cool. We just formed a board. We're going to have several presentations at the upcoming World Conference in San Francisco. We have a monthly peer consultation group for therapists who are currently providing harm reduction and psychedelic integration therapy. We're planning and looking towards offering some trainings. So Nate and I are doing a training on ACT and psychedelics, not through the SIG, but through Portland Psychotherapy. That'll be coming up in May. And so our SIG is growing, and we're just trying to disseminate ACT within ACBS, but also amongst the psychedelic community, because in my experience, at least locally here in Oregon, ACT is not a very popular therapy. A lot of the therapy modalities that are used in psychedelic communities are other things like transpersonal psychology or somatic approaches or IFS. So we're trying to help kind of get the word out that we think ACT is a great fit.
I think there's a common perception that ACT is like it's behavioral, it's very manualized, it's kind of rote or rigid, which is not true, or my experience at all. You know, I my training, it kind of came from a background of more humanistic training, and a lot of, I think, therapists that come from that background, they view ACT and they put it in this box of like it's rigid and manualized and not very flexible. So we try to dispel that when we can, and because, as Brian mentioned, I think both of us view it as extremely conceptually useful in sort of forming that bridge between the experiences that we might have on psychedelics and then back into our conceptual reality, in which we do live by this map, and we need to augment that map. And we need language to do that. And I think the language ACT gives us is a useful language to sort of help augment the way we see the world a little bit, to be more in line with things that we learn maybe when we have insights from a psychedelic experience.
Beautiful.
I think it would be important to mention that there's when we talk about psychedelics, Nate, when Nate talked about the history, it's important context, because essentially, at least in this country, we have taken away the sacred medicines of some cultures because we said they are illegal or whatever, and they weren't able to practice, or we made it difficult to practice. And then now suddenly we're saying, oh, we've discovered that these are okay, and we're sanctioning them or something like that. And so there's cultures who haven't been able to practice with their sacred medicine, and further than that, because of the rise of interest in psychedelics, there's cultures now who there's like literally not enough of their medicine. There's not enough peyote. There's not enough ayahuasca, et cetera, for use in the cultures that they came from. In fact, in the U.S., a lot of decriminalization efforts are trying to decriminalize all drugs except for mescaline and peyote, because Native American cultures don't want that to be accessible to the rest of the rest of the country, because there's not enough for them, and there's harm from Westerners going into some of these cultures and seeking psychedelic experiences. So that's one issue, and another is simply that psychedelic assisted therapy is going to be really expensive, likely when it first gets out. It will be unclear if insurance covers it, and so who will have access to this treatment first? It'll probably more wealthy people, which repeats the systemic imbalances that are prevalent in our healthcare. Marginalized communities will have the least access, and you can argue, and I do argue, need it more because there's more rates of mental health problems. There's more problems. So there's a lot of cultural issues that are important to be aware of. As we're really doing this big grand experiment of how do we introduce psychedelics into a legal mainstream context.
Yeah.
That's why I think we have to be very careful. I think it's we can't, in my view, take a medical only approach. Like a medical only approach being we go through the FDA approval process and it becomes a medicine, and then that medicine is prescribable, because you're going through so many systems right there that it just ratchets up the price, and and it does, and it leaves in place a unjust and unworkable system of prohibition. So in my view, it's imperative to support decriminalization efforts always, and that you can't. I think it's wrong. I'll just say, I think it's wrong to support medicalization and not support decriminalization. It leaves oppressive structures in place. It continues to put people in jail. So you have to take a decriminalization approach along with this, I think, to ethically be on anything remotely like solid ground. Yeah. And I think that can also drive down the price too, right? Because if someone has access to a psilocybin experience, then they don't have to go through a professional to have that. They will go through the professional if it's affordable, and they think that is that helps them. But if it's something that's going to cost $10,000, there's other ways that people will get around that. There are anyway. But I think if we decriminalize it, make everything above board, and don't allow it to be turned into this highly profitable product, I think that's really, really important. So I mean, now is a crucial time in my view. It's a very crucial time in which sort of post prohibition policy is being developed, and so I think it is a really important time to be involved. And I think supporting decriminalization is vital to the future of a fair and just psychedelic future.
Yeah. Important point to make too. Decriminalization does not equate to legalization, correct? So is decriminalization?
No, although I think
Denver.
Yeah.
But it's not it's not like sold in stores though, is it? You just can't.
Well, decriminalization removes criminal penalties. Decriminalization removes criminal penalties. Legalization would be, which I support. Legalization is creating a legal framework for it to be sold, either directly or sold and then used on site as in a supervised manner. So that's legalization means you can sell it and the government is going to tax you. Basically, that's what legalization means. It means the government's going to take a cut. Decriminalization means you're not selling it and the government's not going to take a cut.
There's so much to explore in this area, and I think we're on the cusp of a potential. People will say things like, paradigm shift in mental health. I don't know, but I think we're definitely on the cusp of a kind of explosion in research, and hopefully when these therapies become FDA approved or accessible to the public, we're going to know a lot more. Right now, if you search the clinical trials database, there's 73 ongoing studies for psilocybin, and there was 20, it's like an exponential growth curve, basically. So it's really exciting times, and I'm really excited about what we're going to find out about how these substances might be used in mental health treatment and beyond.
Yeah. If either one of you become the next Ram Dass, let me know and hook me up.
I think Nate's got the look more than I do.
Yeah, you definitely have the look.
Oh, but I'm against gurus, so no, I don't want to be that.
Well, maybe you're calling. Who knows? Thank you so much for such a wonderful podcast. It was so delightful to talk about this. I hope it really there's so much more, but we'll talk again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, great to chat.
Spit on the ground, hold your breath, try to scare yourself to death. Bury your bones under the dirt and tear at your heart and rip your shirt and stomp your feet in disgust. Curse the gray skies if you must, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. Break your heart and give up the race before you start. Drop your drawers and roll around. Burn your house right to the ground. Go to sleep, hit your head, screaming till your face is red, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. Blue skies, setting sun, cherry pie